Have you ever noticed how some people walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention without trying? They're not necessarily the smartest person there. They're not the funniest. They're not the loudest. And yet somehow everyone wants to talk to them. Meanwhile, you might be standing there thinking, what do they have that I don't? And if you've ever asked yourself that question, I need you to hear this very carefully. The answer is probably not what you think. Because being interesting has almost nothing to do with becoming someone else. It has almost everything to do with finally allowing people to see who you already are. And that realization changed my entire understanding of confidence, communication, and human connection. See, for the longest time, I believed that interesting people were born with some secret ingredient. I thought they had better stories, bigger personalities, more exciting lives. I remember walking into social events and mentally preparing myself like I was about to sit an exam. I'd think, okay, say something smart, say something funny, don't be awkward, don't run out of things to say. And do you know what happened? I became the least interesting version of myself. Because when you're trying desperately to be interesting, you're not actually connecting with anyone. You're performing. And people can feel the difference. Have you ever had a conversation where you felt like you were watching someone sell themselves? They had all the right stories, all the right jokes, all the right opinions, but somehow you walked away feeling nothing. Then you've probably also had the opposite experience. You meet someone who talks about baking bread, or collecting old maps, or fixing motorcycles, and somehow you listen to them for an hour without getting bored. Why? Because interesting people don't have interesting topics. They have an interesting relationship with what they're talking about. And once I understood that, everything changed. Let me tell you about a man I met years ago. I was traveling and ended up sitting next to an older gentleman on a train. Now, if you asked me beforehand whether I'd enjoy a 2-hour conversation about gardening, my answer would have been absolutely not. But this man started telling me about tomatoes. Tomatoes. He described how different varieties had different personalities. He talked about the smell of soil after rain. He explained how he spent 3 years trying to grow one particular heirloom tomato because his grandfather used to grow it when he was a child. By the end of the train ride, I wanted to become a farmer. Not because tomatoes are inherently fascinating, but because passion is fascinating. And that's the first lesson most people never learn. If you want to become more interesting, stop trying to find interesting things to say. Start becoming genuinely interested in things. Read about subjects that make you curious. Watch documentaries that pull you in. Explore hobbies you've secretly wanted to try. Ask questions that don't have practical answers. Because here's something strange about human psychology. People are rarely attracted to perfection. They're attracted to aliveness. Think about the most memorable person you've ever met. Were they perfect? Probably not. But they were deeply engaged with life. And that engagement becomes contagious. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. That's great. But my life isn't that interesting. Can I challenge that belief for a second? Because I used to believe the exact same thing. I thought interesting people climbed mountains and started companies and traveled to remote islands while I was just existing. Then one day, a friend asked me a question that completely stopped me. He said, "What's something you could talk about for 30 minutes without preparing?" And I immediately had an answer. Communication, human behavior, why people say what they say, why confidence changes the sound of your voice, why some stories captivate us and others don't. I could talk about that forever. And he smiled and said, "Then that's your interesting." That sentence stayed with me because every person has something they naturally light up when discussing. The problem is, we often dismiss it because it's familiar to us. You think your passion isn't interesting because you've lived with it your entire life. The chef thinks cooking is normal. The gamer thinks strategy is normal. The teacher thinks psychology is normal. The artist thinks creativity is normal. But what feels ordinary to you can be extraordinary to someone else. So here's a challenge. Ask yourself, what topic makes you forget to check your phone? What conversation makes you lose track of time? What problem do you enjoy solving even when nobody pays you to solve it? That's where your interesting begins. But there's another reason people struggle to become interesting, and this one hurts a little. We're too busy trying to sound impressive. Have you ever told a story and secretly edited parts of it to make yourself look smarter, funnier, more successful? Of course you have. We've all done it. And ironically, every time we do that, we become less interesting. Because interesting people aren't interesting because they win all the time. They're interesting because they're willing to reveal that they're human. I'll give you an example. Imagine two people telling you about learning how to drive. The first person says, "I passed my test easily. Everything went perfectly." The second person says, "I accidentally turned on the windshield wipers instead of the indicator during my driving exam, panicked, and then thanked the examiner for surviving the experience." Who do you remember? Exactly. Perfection is forgettable, humanity is memorable. One of the greatest communication skills you can develop is learning how to share your flaws without losing your confidence. Because confidence isn't pretending you're flawless. Confidence is being okay with people seeing that you're not. And when you do that, something magical happens. People stop evaluating you. They start relating to you. Now, there's another secret that transformed the way I interact with people. The most interesting person in the room is often the most interested person in the room. Think about that. We've been taught that being interesting means having great stories and clever insights. But have you ever met someone who made you feel like the most fascinating person on earth? What did they actually do? They listened. Really listened. They asked follow-up questions. They became curious. They leaned in, and suddenly you felt seen. I once attended an event where I met a man who barely talked about himself for almost an hour. Yet by the end of our conversation, I thought he was one of the most charismatic people I'd ever met. Why? Because he asked me questions nobody had ever asked before. Not, what do you do? But, what's something you're trying to get better at that nobody sees? Not, where are you from? But, what's one thing about where you grew up that shaped who you are? Those questions change the conversation completely. Because most conversations stay on the surface not because people are boring, but because nobody gives them permission to go deeper. So the next time you're worried about sounding interesting, try this instead. Become curious. Ask one more question, then ask another. You'll be amazed how quickly people open up. And here's the twist. As they become more interesting to you, you become more interesting to them. But there's one final lesson that I think matters more than all the others. Stop hiding your weird. I mean it. The parts of yourself you've been trying to smooth out, minimize, and edit away, those are often the exact parts that make you memorable. I used to think I needed to appear polished all the time. Professional, composed, impressive. Then I started sharing the strange observations I genuinely had, the random questions I couldn't stop thinking about, the bizarre analogies that appeared in my head. And instead of people pulling away, they leaned in. Because authenticity creates curiosity. Think about your favorite people. Are they generic? Of course not. They have quirks, odd habits, unique perspectives, specific ways of seeing the world. That's what makes them unforgettable. The truth is, nobody remembers average. Nobody remembers perfectly rehearsed. Nobody remembers someone who spent the entire conversation trying to avoid being judged. People remember emotion, people remember honesty, people remember energy, and perhaps that's why so many people feel invisible. Not because they aren't interesting, but because they've become experts at hiding the parts of themselves that are. So if you've spent years trying to become more interesting, maybe you've been asking the wrong question. Maybe the question isn't, how do I become someone people want to listen to? Maybe the real question is, what parts of myself have I been afraid to show? Because becoming interesting isn't about adding something to your personality. It's about removing the fear that's been covering it. And one day you'll be in a conversation, you'll stop trying to impress, you'll stop trying to perform, you'll stop trying to become someone else. You'll talk about the thing you genuinely care about. You'll ask the question you're genuinely curious about. You'll laugh the way you naturally laugh. And you'll notice something extraordinary happen. People will lean in. Not because you changed who you are, but because for the first time, they finally got to meet you.